Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome. Today's August 5th, Wednesday. This is our Ask Me Anything in our new schedule format. My name's Timothy Clancy, the Chief Mulleteer. This is Bonky, the Emotional Support Donkey. And a few administrative items at the top of the hour. We've got a new schedule here at the InfoMullet. Rather than doing weekly Ask Me Anythings that we're getting kind of very intensive to keep up with that, we're splitting them now to every 2 weeks. So the schedule, if you haven't seen the notice, just so you're not, the first and the third Wednesdays of the month, that's where we're going to have our Facebook Live Ask Me Anything, as we are having now. The full episode will always go up on YouTube the Friday after the Ask Me Anything. And the individual segments where we break the full episode up into the 5 or 10-minute segments so it's a little easier to digest, those go up on the Thursday the week after. So in between the Ask Me Anythings, we're going to try and do at least one long-form article a month post. I did one last week on the doctrine of China's international affairs and strategic doctrine, so that every week you're getting a little something from the InfoMullet. And all of this, of course, if you want to support this, check us out at www.patreon.com/infomullet. $5 to become a mulleteer subscriber. We really appreciate all the support that we get from folks, and it makes a lot of this possible. So welcome to those who just joined. We've got a mix today of domestic affairs and foreign affairs. And where I wanted to start out, because it's been a few weeks, is I wanted to start out with an update on the pandemic responses and focus on the national responses. So back in March, we outlined 5 national responses that seemed to be emerging. It was the People's War, which was sort of the Chinese response, the pandemic panopticon, which was the Korean response, the hammer and the dance, which you saw of a lot of major countries. You had induced herd immunity, tested by a lot of countries, abandoned by all but Sweden. And you also had what we've come to call the thoughts and prayers approach of the United States. So what I wanted to do is start out with an update of where we are on those. So let me bring up here. And so in June, on 24th of June, we shared these 2 things. And this is a representative example of the pandemic responses of 4 of those different strategies. I selected 4 countries that are sort of endemic of this type of response. So just to clear the chart so everyone can understand how the chart's being written, on the left, the vertical axis, this is the daily new cases per 100,000. It's a 7-day moving average. So it's a lagged over the last 7 days. That gets a little bit of the jerkiness out and the noise of the data. And it's got on the bottom right are the days since the first confirmed case in that country. So all the countries are aligned to start at the same time, which means their lines at the end are going to end at different times because some countries have had the pandemic longer than others. And the 4 countries we're profiling are the ones I just mentioned. We have Germany, which is modeling the hammer and the dance. The hammer is where you go in a lockdown to build your testing capability, your contact tracing. You go into the dance, which is a partial reopen or even a full reopen, because you've got those capabilities in place, but you're ready to go back in the lockdown with the hammer. So the hammer and the dance is probably the strategy I've been recommending the most. The pandemic panopticon is what South Korea, Singapore, and some countries with prior SARS experience, mainly in South Asia and Southeast Asia, have been using. That is a very heavy technological effort with complete awareness of where infected individuals are. It runs into a little bit of civil liberties issues when that kind of, and privacy laws, when that technology comes over into Western Europe and the US, but it is a response that we're seeing. And then what we've called the thoughts and prayers approach with the US, which is sort of like, we'll go into lockdown, kind of, and then we'll get out of the lockdown, kind of, and just kind of hope things work out. So this was in June. I want to be clear, this is date current as of June 24th. And you can see here the 4 countries and the responses. Again, these are representative of lots of different countries trying this. We're not the only one doing thoughts and prayers. Germany's not the only one doing in hammer and dance, but it's representative. So, and the daily new cases, you can see that the hammer and the dance and the pandemic panopticon were good at causing that nice growth and decline of an initial outbreak and at lower levels than other responses. You can see here the induced herd immunity of Sweden That's where they kept it relatively open, but trying to protect the elderly population. That didn't really work so well and had a spike. And then, of course, the U.S. approach has struggled. So when we look here back in June, we were looking at the deaths per capita. So again, to clear the chart, these are the deaths per capita of 100,000. Now, this is cumulative over time, so you're not going to see these lines decrease because it's an accumulation of deaths over time per capita. But if we think about your overall goals of a national response is to manage the daily cases while minimizing the amount of harm and suffering. And we can use deaths as a proxy because, yes, there's hospitalizations, there's recovery times, there's all that, but obviously death is the most severe. And you can see pretty clearly here how at the time, Sweden and its induced herd immunity was doing the worst overall, had about 50 deaths per 100,000 people. The US was behind it, mid-30s. And then Germany much lower at 10, and the pandemic panopticon in South Korea almost 0. So that's where we were at the end of June. And people were giving me a hard time on YouTube that this was old. So I had some Swedish people yelling at me that it's gotten much better and you aren't reflecting that. So because I take my Swedish audience very seriously, I have updated the charts. Where we stand right now, as of August 4th, not good for the US, as you can see. So again, this is the chart with the 7-day moving average of new cases. And you can see here, again, Germany has contained, they've had a few minor flare-ups. That's the dance doesn't mean you'll never have a flare-up again, but I do these per capita so you can see them normalized across the populations of these countries. You can see them in context. Even though Germany has had some flare-ups, they've never really hit a major issue. Same with South Korea. Now, Sweden, with its induced herd immunity, to the points of the Swedes, their daily new cases have dropped off significantly. And that's a good sign. We'll talk about why here in a second. But it's really dropped off in the last couple weeks. Whereas the United States, we've talked about wave 1.5. I've been talking about it for a while. We knew it was coming. It came out and it had this huge upswing in cases, over to 20 new cases per 100,000. And just in the last couple of days has had this steep drop off. But I want to put this drop off in perspective, right? Because it looks like it's dropping down. This is, first of all, a lot of people are saying, well, this is because the White House is taking the data. It may be data manipulation. It may, but when you have a large outbreak, you have these peaks and declines. Look at Germany. It's got an up and it's got a down. And the reason why is the society begins reacting to this realization of the danger. And if you were, we were not unaware of the dangers. We got up to 60,000, almost 70,000 new cases a day. Then the deaths started raising, and we'll go over that in a second. So it's not unusual to see a steep drop-off, but I want to put this in context. This drop-off, that's only down to 45,000 new cases a day. That's still much worse than at any point throughout the outbreak than these other representative countries. Now, when it comes to deaths per capita, again, the updated chart, this is the response. And this is why it's important to look at these charts from a standpoint of national pandemic response. Germany has flatlined out. They still have a few deaths that happens, but it's largely flat. South Korea is, I think, at a couple hundred. Germany's at maybe 5,000, but normalized for the population, they're at 10 deaths per 100,000. But look at what's going on here with Sweden and the US. This is why induced herd immunity is such a bad pandemic response to pick, in that even though they finally got the outbreak under control, it looks like the daily new cases, they have suffered so many casualties in Sweden that if their population adjusted numbers, we're still catching up to them. Even with all the deaths going on in the United States, when you normalize it across populations, we're still playing catch up. Now, it's possible that Sweden will flatten out here and we'll catch up and exceed it because we continue to have a problem that we're not able to control. But I wanted to put in context of Sweden in its neighborhood. So Sweden exists in the Baltic neighborhood. It's got Finland, Norway on one side, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania on the other. Across the sea, it's got Germany, Denmark's around there. And these other countries are important to understand the regional context of why is Sweden now able to control its outbreak where it wasn't before, and how is it doing relative to them? So this chart I've shown before, but it's been updated, and to clear it, on the left, again, deaths per 100,000 in a simple column now because it's a category. It's not over time, it's a category. But I've also superimposed the population density per country, because people are sometimes saying, well, Sweden has a higher population density than Norway, and that's why it's not doing as well. So, okay, on the right side is the population density per square kilometer. And what it just shows really clearly is Sweden's death per 100,000 is up here about 55. And it's way higher than all its neighbors: Denmark, Germany, Finland, Norway, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. And sure, some of these countries have a lower population density than Sweden, but Denmark and Germany have a much higher population density. Even Lithuania, which is a dense city area, has a higher, and they're doing much better. So part of Sweden's benefit is that the neighborhood it's in is managing this much better than Sweden has. So there's no reservoir to reinfect Sweden from its neighboring countries. There's no ability for the infection outbreak to continue breaking out. Like, imagine if Georgia were taken, we took all the states and we took Georgia out and we surrounded it with Massachusetts, Washington, Arkansas, Montana, these states, Hawaii. We kind of surrounded Georgia with states that are doing really, really well. If Georgia ever beat the outbreak, there'd be no reinfection reservoirs from which to bring it to. But the problem in the US is we have a lot of reinfection reservoirs regionally that as one area beats the outbreak, it can be reinfected from another area. And that's the real challenge of wave 1.5, which brings me to where we're at on the death rate, just to show you the average death rate in the US. The US is now doing objectively worse. If we were to take Sweden today and compare it to the US is doing objectively worse on just about any measure. But I've been tracking this chart for a while, again, to clear it. Daily deaths, now we're in an absolute number per day. And it's the columns, the blue columns are the deaths per day, and the red is a 7-day moving average. And you can see this sort of weekend pattern where it goes down over the weekend and spikes up. And we've got the two major revisions highlighted where a state had a backlog and dumped a bunch of deaths on that day from the backlog, but we're not entirely sure where they were allocated. So I've just called those out, but you can see the overall pattern here forming of the wave 1.5, or what I've called the double hump. You have that first rise and peak in the New Jersey, New York supercluster. You have that long, slow, painful decline over May. Well, we're still over 1,000 deaths on average on the 7-day average. And then we drop here in May, and this is when, or in, excuse me, June. This is when we start reopening a little bit in May, even as late as April. Some states are reopening, but pretty much by mid-May, all the states are reopened. We think we're doing well. People are trying to warn it, but everyone's ignoring it. And now we've had that return increase back up to where the last week to week and a half, we've had 900, 1,000 deaths a day during the week. And then those drop to a couple hundred over the weekend. And that's right now where we're at, unfortunately, on the sort of where we're at. So when we look at national pandemic responses, I think we can still say those countries that are doing the hammer and the dance are doing much, much better. And that's one reason I put these in population adjusted sizes. I see Ms. Falkenberry here is asking about, is Korea because of a smaller population? By doing it per capita, we normalize those differences. So we were looking in those earlier charts per 100,000. And Rory's asking about Australia. The increase of cases in Australia, and Rory's asking about, what's the name? I want to say it's Wales. There's a province in Australia that's been locked down, and a specific city. And they're basically doing the hammer and the dance, and that area has gone from the dance back to the hammer. If you look at the cases per capita, it would be much lower than the US, but they're still going back into the lockdown in those areas, which is what you want to see, because you don't want the cases to get as high as they are in the US, because that's what breaks the curve and you fail to flatten the curve and the death rate spikes. So that, yeah, Australia is struggling right now in a specific province, and especially in a specific city, and it's one of the more populous ones. But I think if you were to compare, Rory, the population per capita, you would find that Australia has introduced the lockdowns at a much lower level than what we are in the US, because right now in the US, we're not even, considering lockdowns. Although fortunately, the school reopening that I talked about a few weeks ago, our last episode on school reopenings, I predicted people would not want to reopen schools. And we've seen some bad results of camps and schools being reopened, and now a serious consideration of keeping them closed. But Joe Hogan asked, before the AMA, and I want to get this before we go into the domestic and other affairs, last bit on COVID. He asked, what does this mean in terms of travel? What does this mean for where can we travel? Where will we be able to travel? What kinds of travel will be open? And so I brought back up the, this is from the Austrian Complexity Institute, this link. All the links for this stuff are in the notes of this, and they'll be, if you're watching on YouTube, they're in the comments below the YouTube. So this is a worldwide map done by the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, Austria, and it's got a simple green, yellow, red, and what they're doing is taking the positive cases per 10,000 inhabitants within last 14 days. Green is under 1 positive case, yellow is under 10, and red is over 10. So you can see here what I'm talking about. You know, when we talk about, here's Sweden, by the way. You know, it's really decreased, or excuse me, that's Finland. Sweden's here in the middle. 3 positive cases per 10,000. That's a nice decrease, but it's surrounded by green or lower countries that are doing better, which is one reason I think it's able to contain this. Anywhere there's green on this map, you're going to see regional trade blocks I've described before begin to offer limited tourism between the green countries, maybe some of the yellow countries as well, as they keep it under control. Anywhere that's red, I wouldn't anticipate travel, at least legal travel. I would anticipate bans on tourism, bans on business travel, disruption of supply and trade. I mean, obviously containers are different than people, so you're going to still see some of that. But where the reds are on this map, you're going to continue to see very serious travel restrictions that have risen up as the second wave outbreaks. And Rory, to your question, although it doesn't break down Australia overall or into the individual provinces, you're talking 2.5 cases per 10,000. Overall, and in the US, we can just pick a state here, like South Carolina, 41 cases per 10,000, Georgia, 47, Florida, 61, Arizona, 47. So, I mean, it's yes, Australia has had a new surge and it's controlling it, but it's doing it, that dance, at a much lower level, which is, you know, what you want to see people to do it. Thanks, Guy mentioned it was Victoria province in Melbourne. Thanks for that. So that's the COVID update. I think we're all familiar with wave 1.5. Wanted to pause here. If you haven't yet, like, follow, share the InfoMullet page on Facebook. You know, share this video out if people are interested. We're about to get into the Portland protests, and then after that, China relations. And if you haven't become a Patreon subscriber yet, check it out, patreon.com/infomullet. $5 a month becomes a mulleteer, and you get access to the ability to vote on what topics we're going to cover, help us prioritize, and some of those goodies like that. So I wanted to pause here from the COVID and get into the Portland protests, because this is something that happened between the last time I was on the air and now. Is these Portland protests really blew up. I mean, it's been happening for a while. And what I wanted to do is, first of all, I want to put a general caveat, because I know tensions are high on this. So how I'm going to approach this is I'm not going to get into individual acts of I saw this Twitter video or that video, except for very few specific cases. And the goal here is not to legislate who is or who isn't the bad actor at an individual, you know, isolate on a tweet level. I think a lot of times when people try and argue that, they're trying to, rather than seek to understand, they're seeking to be right. And they want to say, well, this video proves that my side is right and your side is wrong. I'm going to try and take a different view to provide some context on this and talk about an aggregate. We may use 1 or 2 specific examples. And also remember the rules. Everyone behave yourselves. I got my ban page up. If someone jumps in and starts saying nonsense, you don't need to go back at them. I'll take care of them. Don't worry about it. So just everyone be kind to each other and we'll get through this. So Portland is a great example of the accidental guerrilla dynamic. And I've been talking about accidental guerrilla for years now. This is a theory that comes out of counterinsurgency. It was originally proposed by David Kukulin, who's probably one of the best counterinsurgency theorists in the world. And I wanted to, like, when I talk about context, everyone's down in the Twitter and the images. There's a system structure to what happened in Portland. And this system structure is common. It's ubiquitous all over the world, whether we're talking about insurgencies or nonviolent protests. It's called this accidental guerrilla syndrome. And I wanted to walk through how that structure develops and then show it in action in Portland, because I think Portland's a really good example of it in effect. So what I'm going to do is hop over here to Vensim, where I do a lot of my modeling. So I apologize for all the tools and stuff. This is this is kind of like going in the lab, you know, for a little bit. And what these are showing is feedback structures And those who have seen this before, you know these are feedback loops. And what I'm going to do is walk through this feedback structure and try and explain piece by piece how this builds, and then we'll see how it played out in Portland. So as in all systems, we're going to start arbitrarily just for the point of reference. We're going to talk about radicals integrating in a near space. And a near space here could be physical, like a city or town, or it could be conceptual, like where I am. The near space is the locality that the radicals are integrating in. And by integrate, I mean they're part of the community. They've been there for a while. They have relationships. They may be residents, or they may even have familiarity, but they're integrating in this community. They're not outsiders. They're locals to that. And being radicals, they're going to do provocations. That's what radical means, right? You know, whether you look at Black Lives Matter or the Sons of Liberty or any of these groups, part of radical, civil protest and civil disturbance is to provoke and create a response. And again, we've talked on the edges here. Sometimes in those crowds, you have some bad actors that are doing some bad stuff. These are very complex situations, but the point of a radical action is to raise awareness through a provocation. And so what you see here is as the radicals integrate in the near space, they create provocations. And those provocations lead to the growth in radicals. More people get aware, more people get activated. They join that effort. So here we go. As provocations increase, right, instability increases. And as instability increases, this may lead to a near intervention. I'm using near and far here to identify both a geographical space in the context of Portland or a conceptual space if you want to use this somewhere else. This could be entirely virtual, but you know, my Reddit channel or my Infomullet community is my near space, but the far space might be Reddit overall or people on the internet. So near here intervention are forces that are near, the local police, the local community. As instability rises, they're going to want to do interventions which will reduce the provocations, and this creates a limits to growth. It's a classic structure. Nothing can grow forever. It's going to find its limits. So here you have this tug and pull that's creating, there is growth in the radicals with their provocations, but there's also limits. And what drives those limits is the tolerance in the near space for this particular form of instability. So as instability increases, it decreases the tolerance for that instability, which in turn leads to an increased desire for near interventions. Now, this little hash mark here is a symbol for time delay. These feedback structures don't all happen in an instant, and it's what makes complex systems really, really tricky, is that this is a delayed response. So if these radicals integrating in the near space are causing a massive amounts of instability that is no longer being tolerated by the community, it's going to show, but it's going to take time. And during that time, there may not be as many near interventions, so there's more provocations and more radicals. But if they reach a threshold of we're done with you, we're not going to tolerate this anymore, that's when you might see this actually increase, which leads to more interventions. And these interventions need not be police. They could be community-based pressure of, hey, knock that out, guys. We're tired of this. We're done with this, right? So this is a limited near space interaction that's going on in Portland. And what happened is with the George Floyd protest, and we'll see in the next chart when I go through the actual numbers, this was going on from the beginning of the George Floyd protest. There were nightly protests, often centered on the Justice Center there in downtown Portland, which happens, very important for our story, to be next door to a federal courthouse. That's key, and we'll come in later. But this is what was going on. It's all local. It's all in the near space. It's all happening there in Portland. It's in a limited area downtown, largely confined between the protesters and the police and going back and forth. But then, as instability arises, what triggers the accidental guerrilla syndrome is that there's a desire to aggressively intervene by a far actor. The far actor is one who doesn't live in this space. It's not integrated in that space. It's not local. It's perceived as the far actor. In this case, it was the federal government. As President Trump declared an executive order, we're going to protect the courthouses. We're going to do this. They ordered in the federal agents. And the key here is an aggressive intervention. You can actually have far actors supporting the near actors and doing what are called civil affairs type work. You know, they're supporting, but it's not aggressive. But this dynamic here in green is an aggressive intervention. And what happens is it's the goal of the aggressive intervention is to fix, right? The visible system. Think of this as a visible system. I'm seeing the instability of the nightly protests, and I'm seeing, you know, and you know, it's technically arson, but a lot of these fires you could put out with your feet. You know, it's graffiti. This is upsetting. People get upset. I see that in the visible system, so I'm going to go intervene, and I'm going to fix the visible system. This near intervention loop isn't working to my satisfaction. The time delay, I haven't allowed enough, whatever the cause. I'm going to intervene to reduce the instability. And this is a fix. It's intended to fix the problem. The problem is it's only half of what's called a fixes that fail structure. And fixes that fail are a specific kind of system structure where you put in place a fix to the visible system that in a short term seems to be working, but in the long term is creating an accumulation of unintended consequences that actually erode the benefit you think you're getting. And in this case, as you aggressively intervene by the far actor, you trip these accidental guerrillas. And an accidental guerrilla is someone who is in the near space. It's not a protester, right? A protester's out there, they're activated, they're radical. But the accidental guerrilla is seeing someone who's the far actor coming into their space and being like, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing here? We got this. This is local. We don't need you involved. And I use the analogy, if you've ever seen a family, like a rancher family or a farm family, something with like 5 boys or maybe a mix of boys or girls, that family will fight constantly. Like you go to a high school and you got 4 of those kids in high school or 5 of those kids in high school throughout the different years, right? Whatever, through the school system, they'll be fighting each other all the time. That's the conflict of the near actors. They're all siblings. But any outside actor picks on one of those 5 and the entire family comes together and reacts to the outside actor. And it's, the technical term is called segmented lineage. And it gives rise to like these sayings you hear in the Arab world: me against my brother and I against my cousin and I against the world. It's a series of these recognitions that as you go from the near space and a far actor comes in it, you can activate local actors who, and that's why they're called accidental guerrillas. They didn't start out intending to be protesters or radicals. They are accidental in that they are reacting to the intervention of the far actor. And what this does is, as that aggressive intervention increases, the number of accidental guerrillas increase. And that actually causes more instability because you've got more people, more protesters. Now it's just not the radicals you were dealing with. It's the, and you saw this in Portland, like the mom's wall and the veterans wall and the dads with leaf blowers and the bold, you know, all these different groups that came into the protest, weren't there originally, but came in when they saw this reaction. And this creates a fixes that fail. Also, some of these accidental guerrillas over time become radicalized. If I'm a Navy veteran and I go up and talk to the officers and they break my hand and they put me in the hospital, I might become radicalized by that experience. So the interaction, some accidental guerrillas eventually become radicals and join that because they've been radicalized by the interaction with this aggressive response. And this, by the way, this is not limited to just protest. This is exactly what happened in Afghanistan. You know, you think about how does a Taliban of a couple thousand people in 2005 end up with 80,000 fighters by 2010, 2011? It's this dynamic. It's that a lot of Afghans weren't for the Taliban, but when we had an upsurge or the resurge of moving in heavy into Helmand province and areas like that in 2008, 2009, and began the surge, they saw a much more robust US response, like, hey, these foreign actors are coming into our area. We're going to pick up arms and resist them. This is a very key dynamic to understand in any sort of asymmetric conflict. So this fixes that fail is now operating in tandem with this limits to growth. And what happens is over time, there's a potential here of what's called the rejection of the far actor. So this near space tolerance for instability, these are what's called the battle of narratives. You can see here on the left, they reject the narrative on the radicals. On the right, they reject the narrative of the far actor. And this is what we talk about asymmetric conflict being a battle between narratives of the near radical group and the far actor, and the population is going to choose between those. And if they choose to reject the far actor, they're going to act as a limit to exert, to the extent they can, a limit to that aggressive intervention. And as the aggressive intervention, and all of these things are happening simultaneously. It's an endogenous system. It's now, I've simplified. There's a couple things we could add for additional complexity, but nuance, but this is the core of an accidental guerrilla system structure. And you can actually see it play out in live time with the protest size. So this is, I have a tool that lets me find protest sizes. And so just to clear the chart, again, I always like to clear the chart first. This shows the protest size in Portland overlaid into those phases of the accidental guerrilla dynamic. And on the left side is an estimated protest size. Now, from past work, this is an AI tool. It's aggregating news reports. And I found that it's often underestimating by about 1 to 4. So when you see something up here of 2,000, that could be between 2,000 and 8,000 and 10,000 people. But this is the size of protest based on these estimates. And these gap days here are just lack of reporting. I wouldn't say they were 0 because we know they were protesting every night, but you can kind of look at the peaks here and get a sense. So the George Floyd protests begin right as we head into Memorial Day weekend, right? And you can see they're large, they're small. You have a big protest action here. You have a bridge march. These were the provocations. We can call this the provocation period, right? This is when the protesters are out there doing those nightly protests. And they're, I'm not going to get into legislating each little act, but this is what I would call the provocation phase, right? They're out there, they're maintaining, but you can see it's decreasing in size over time, which is very natural. Energy dissipates, attention gets focused elsewhere. You end up with a hard group left, but the large popular support, it's hard to maintain. It's hard to mobilize mass populations. But then in green here, this is the initial intervention, and this is when the federal agents are sent in on July 4th. Now, look, it's very low here with a few spikes by this point. There's not a lot of protesters. And during this intervention, I don't think the country was aware of it. You were certainly aware of it in Portland, but I've marked this this phase point here, this phase transition. Actually, on July 11th, there was a protester who took a hammer claw to some federal agents. Like, he was up by the door, and as soon as they came out, he tried to swing his hammer. That was an aggressive action that I think clearly criminal. Guy needs to go to jail. But 2 days later, the reason most people don't know that is 2 days later, a peaceful protester was shot in the head by non-lethal impact rounds, sent to the hospital in critical condition. And I've used that date to mark what I would call the aggressive interaction here. And this aggressive intervention is a much more robust presence. You get the people, the federal agents in what looks like military gear, the camouflage, you see the unmarked vans and the arrests and all that, and I'll get into that in a bit here. But this phase, you can see this transition phase here, and I marked it the day that the protester got shot in the head. And look what happens. The accidental guerrilla dynamic kicks off, and all of a sudden you've got your wall of veterans, your dads with leaf blowers, your wall of moms, your looky-loos are coming in who they may have been considering getting involved throughout this time, but this is where they finally show up, and all of a sudden your protest sizes are much larger than they were. This is why the accidental guerrilla dynamic is important. A lot of these protesters are only reacting to the aggressive intervention by the FAR actor in the near space. You go through the accidental guerrilla dynamic, and you get to the final phase, which is the rejection of the federal FAR actor. This is when the governor and Vice President Pence came to an agreement. The federal agents agreed to withdraw from confrontation. There's been a little confusion. It's not like they've left the city. They're still in the courthouse, but they're no longer engaging in that direct aggressive intervention with the protesters on a nightly basis, and that's cut the dynamic. That's cut the accidental guerrilla dynamic, and you see a sharp drop off. Now, the data I had only goes through August 2nd, sort of end of July, August. So it's only capturing the first few days, but you see this sharp drop off. And if we looked at this in a couple days, I would imagine that again, the size of the crowds may be a little higher than this low period because you've radicalized some of those accidental guerrillas, but it's going to be much smaller and much more manageable than it was during the midst of this accidental guerrilla outbreak. And that shows you the danger of this. So let me go back and ask some questions here, if there's any questions on the system structure before we get into like the detail analysis of the unmarked vans and the arrest. Yeah, by the way, welcome to a couple folks here showing up. Kevin Lane definitely has behavior issues. Agree, Kevin, good to see you. Ms. Falkenberry is asking, would a provocative government response also be considered a growth of radicalism, or is a radical response? Not sure how to word this. No. So in this case, we identify with operational terms the near actor and the far actor. And in this case, we isolate and say the radicalism is a exhibited trait of the near actor. We could describe the, I think I prefer the term aggressive for federal rather than calling it radical. We could call it radical in the operational term of it's a departure from the norm, but that causes confusion when people are like, what's radical and what's not. So when we do these system structures, we pick terms and we isolate them into things to say, here's the near actor and here's the far actor, and try and avoid duplication of terms that can cause confusion. Now, clearly you could describe the federal action as a radical action because it's not been done before. It's not a traditional response. This is, when this accidental guerrilla dynamic kicked off in the Bundy standoff in BLM, the BLM initially went in hot and heavy. They had dogs, they had tasers, they were really aggressive, and boom, like that, a couple hundred people, maybe even 1,000 people showed up overnight, and this is in southern Nevada. The BLM withdrew. They wisely withdrew. The normal reaction of since at least Waco and Ruby Ridge and the move in Philadelphia and some of these bad incidences, the normal reaction to this kind of provocation is to give them room, isolate it, contain it, let the energy dissipate. You have the Mahler wildlife refugee, which I can never spell correctly, so Lucas will correct my spelling. They seized this federal property, but the FBI largely encircled them, waited them out over the winter, waited for their energy to dissipate. There are ways of managing this, but certainly the federal reaction in this is a radical departure, but we don't call it radical because we're trying to avoid the confusion between terms and the different sides of the actors. John Custis is talking about Egypt, Morsi, Sisi, all classic example of these points. Security becomes an overarching concern. Exactly. So, and I think some specific cases in Egypt, you obviously had Morsi overreact to the Arab Spring. He lost his position. Sisi comes in after effectively a coup and absolutely brutally crushes down on the Muslim Brotherhood. But now you've created this accidental guerrilla network, and it just caused problems in Egypt. Tyler, good that you're following along. Yeah, so Ms. Falconberry, that would social media protests sometimes count as radical protest? Yes, so this is why the structure is ubiquitous. I've framed it in this context of Portland, but you can think of Nearspace as my Facebook page, right? And I can tell you this from example. I can watch the accidental guerrilla dynamic play off, right? We are all debating in my social media space, my Facebook page, we're having good debates, and then someone comes in and picks up the ball, and they're rude to people, and all of a sudden everyone else is like getting up in arms. They become accidental guerrillas because some outsider has come into our space, and even though we have our disagreements, we tend to coalesce around our own, and that they begin reacting to that far space. And you can see this. So these spaces, near space and far space, they can be entirely conceptual. It can be my Facebook page versus the internet. It can be a Reddit community. It can be a gaming club, a gaming club. A lot of us folks here are gamers. Are like, the gaming club obviously has a lot of struggle and dissent, but that's internal. And when an outsider comes in and criticizes it, they circle the wagons. There's a lot of ways you can play with the structural dynamic. That's why it's ubiquitous. It's called a generic structure. The terms in those feedback loops may change a little bit to kind of clarify what you're talking about, but the general system structure remains consistent. Kevin's asking, it would be interesting to overlay this framework with future protests to predict conflict instances or even injuries. I'd imagine there's a predictive value. Kevin, there is an amazing predictive value. If you saw on my Facebook, I was saying that very early on, I was saying DHS is not tall enough for this ride. And it's because I'm very familiar with the accidental guerrilla dynamic. And I saw it playing out in live time. And I knew, I don't know for sure. I'm not Nostradamus over here. I can't do that level of bad poetry. But I know I've seen this dynamic play out. And I'm like, DHS is not tall enough for the ride. They're biting off more than they can chew. They're activating this dynamic, and you can see where it's going to go. Likewise, John's talking about Egypt. You can use these to analyze foreign events. You can use them to analyze situations abroad. It's the key thing to remember is it's not these generic structures. If we sat down for a couple hours, they can manifest many different kinds of behaviors. It's not all foreordained to be one thing. For example, if the radical actor hasn't integrated in the near space isn't going to tolerate them, and they're going to choose that narrative to increase interventions. You may never get to a far space intervention. So there's a lot of permutations that can occur, but yes, this general framework has forecasting power. And that's the reason I use them. I actually use them in my profession. Trisha, I'm going to pause on that one about the administration motivations. How is this policy decided upon? Well, I'll just go in there, and my opinion is that the administration was looking for campaign benefit, some electoral points, and they wanted to show that they were being tough on crime and reacting, with this instability that is occurring side by side with the George Floyd protests. And that was the cause of the intervention. People will argue that and say, well, no, there's a legitimate need to protect the courthouses. I'm going to get into that in a bit here as in this next section, but that's just, I think what they were hoping, if I were advising DHS, I would have totally advised them to do something different. There's a path, knowing the accidental guerrilla dynamic, there's one path to effectively create stability. But if your goal is to get election benefit, or to show you're being tough on a liberal city, or to break apart Antifa because you consider them a dangerous group, then you might take a different route. But these are not, I want to be careful that this structure isn't just limited to Portland. The US and Iraq really tripped off the accidental guerrilla as well, because of the way we behaved initially when we're dealing with the citizens. This can happen, and it's also blue folks on the blue side have to be careful about this dynamic as well. I'm sure it happens in a lot of social justice groups where you have conflicts that end up, this debate about cancel culture, all these things. You can use this paradigm to understand, as long as you can identify near space and far space, near actor and far actor, and have a fairly good objective read, as in you have some distance, you're not too close to it, as to which side is doing what. So let's jump in. The next part of the Portland protest that I wanted to get into, what are the limits of federal arrest powers? So this was a big topic that came out with some viral videos that showed federal agents and federal officers in what looked like military camouflage gear. It wasn't military, but it was federal, with heavy weaponry, arresting people. And there's questions of they're not driving marked vehicles, they're not identifying themselves during the arrest. And I wanted to take this in two parts. I wanted to talk about the general context of federal arrest powers, because I think there would be a good backgrounder to get everyone in the same level set. And this is, everyone's like, great, now he's going to become a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a law degree. I'm an analyst, but I am relying on Lawfare blog and their articles in there. They do a pretty good analysis. So I'm going to try and lay out the general rules. Then we're going to go in this specific case in Portland, and I'm going to try and, as objectively I can, apply these rules to what happened in that viral video. So first of all, within Department of Homeland Security is an agency called the Federal Protective Services, and they have the authority to protect all federal property. There's like 9,000 federal facilities in the US. Their job is to protect them. They were what was deployed in Portland under the pretext of the courthouse, the federal courthouse, and one of the federal plazas was being defaced, vandalized, arson, whatever you want to call it. That is their legal job, is to protect the courthouse. Underneath them, a bunch of agencies were sort of mobilized. You have from Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, you have groups like ICE, Custom Border Patrol, US Marshals, FBI. These groups, including some fairly elite teams, like some hostage rescue teams, some elite high-value teams, they're being deputized under Federal Protective Services. This is lawful. You can say, take an agent from one area, I'm deputizing them under another area, and that creates manpower to perform your federal function. I feel kind of bad for these elite hostage rescue teams that are kind of like now assigned to the Federal Protective Service, because it's kind of like, I'm a Delta Force and now I got to go work for the mall cop. And no disrespect for the Federal Protective Services. I'm sure you guys do a great job of federal facilities. I'm not saying anything. I am a Fobbit-dwelling, clipboard-carrying, non-meat-eating analyst when I go overseas. I'm not doing the high tempo operations, but it's actually kind of like being an actual operator and being assigned to someone like me. It's got to be a little bit less glamorous. Anyways, the FBS has these agencies deputized underneath them. They move into Portland, and let's talk about the laws. Two sets of laws are at play. There are federal laws and state laws, and federal officers often are certified in the state they operate in to carry out the enforcement of local laws. So there actually are agreements on the book and by statute, which are, what is the relationship between a federal officer and state authorities? Now, because of the supremacy clause of the Constitution, federal officers can always enforce federal laws, even in any federal law. If they personally observe a violation and they see it, they have the power as a federal law enforcement office to enforce that law. However, if they're enforcing state law, they have to abide by the certification they've received to do the state. So there are certain Oregon laws that they could enforce if they saw someone breaking an Oregon state law, but at least in the Oregon revised statutes, and it's section 133.245, to do that and enforce an Oregon law, they must identify themselves, the reason for the arrest, and transfer them immediately to local custody, a magistrate, local police. They cannot catch and release under state law. So all of a sudden we have this split. If a federal officer is enforcing a federal law, they can do it. If they're enforcing an Oregon law, they must identify themselves, they must state the reason for the arrest, and they must transfer someone to local custody. They cannot detain someone and then release them. What kind of interactions are we talking about when we talk about these laws and these powers? There are three kinds of legal interactions that law enforcement has with citizens. And I'm not saying like, you're at cafeteria and they're in front of you in the line and you're saying hi about the weather. I'm talking about legal law enforcement interactions. They're called contacts, stops, and arrests. And these are very well defined. They've been established by precedent, sometimes going 40 years back, Supreme Court cases, and they have to deal with the level of force being used to inhibit a person's freedom and a corresponding rise in the probable cause that a crime has been committed. And these are all interactions. If you have a warrant, a grand jury's issued a warrant, that's different. You've got a warrant for someone's arrest, they're a material witness. That's all been worked through the grand jury. I'm talking about you're out on the street and you're having an interaction. So it's a contact, a stop, and arrest. And a contact is the lowest form of legal interaction. There's no detention. You can walk away. It's very consensual. It's basically if a cop comes up and says, hey, I want to ask you some questions. That's a contact or an engagement. They don't have to have any probable cause whatsoever to ask you that question. You don't have to talk to them, though. You could say, am I being detained? They say, no, you walk away. It's over, right? This is the lowest level of engagement. It's important to set this as the baseline because as we go up from here, it increases in the implication of force and the inhibition of freedoms and also the requirement to have probable cause. But if a cop wants to come up and ask you a question, they can do it for virtually any reason under the law. A stop is where you are detained to support an investigation. And a stop has a higher level because now the cop's saying, like, you need to answer these. I need to. And if you leave a stop, you may end up being arrested. It needs some form of probable cause. You need to have that the person in front of you has done something criminal to do a stop. And this is where, a traffic stop, right? Well, they sped or they had their license plate was expired. There's some probable cause, an illegal act has been done that justifies the stop. And then, from there, things can escalate. But a stop is to support an investigation. It has a low threshold. An arrest, this is where it gets really key on terms because this will come up in the specific case letter. An arrest is where you are taken into custody, transported to a location, and detained for questioning. That means you've been arrested, even if the word arrest doesn't come up at all. If those things have happened, you have been arrested. And there's a case called Dunaway versus New York, which describes this as an arrest is a person taken from where they were found in a police car or transported to a police station and placed in an interrogation room, right? If you are arrested, you must, and this is not based on a warrant or something, the officer must have good probable cause that you engage in a criminal act, not that you witnessed a criminal act, that you yourself engage, and it has to be a reasonable belief that you did these criminal acts, and that's the standard of probable cause. It's much higher than a contact. A contact, I go up, I just want to ask you some questions. I put you in the car, we're going downtown. I need to have a very solid probable cause case to do that. Now, when it comes to identification, there's a lot of confusion. There is no federal law that requires federal officers to identify themselves or use marked vehicles. And this surprises a lot of people because they're like, now, is it a good idea? Yes. I mean, as a citizen and a radical moderate, I think it's a reasonable assumption that in a free society, we should not have people in uniforms and unmarked vehicles going around using arrest powers. There's obvious reasons why not. And I think we don't need to have like their name and address and phone number, but some sort of reasonable identification. And people pointed out a lot of these federal officers in Portland, they did have tabs that were an alphanumeric. It might say ZT1 or ZT5. But that's, it's camouflage, it's in the moment. You need a big, clear identification so that I know and can explain to someone afterwards that in the heat of the moment, it was number 5 who I was dealing with. You can't hide these things and make them difficult to understand. I don't think that's reasonable. And in fact, a judge in a case that we'll get to later has suggested actually that federal officers in Portland wear sports style jerseys that have a big number on them, that, like, you know, number 7 or number 32 or number 99, right? Some really large identification, because there's a reasonable expectation that we should be able to identify the law enforcement actions we're working with. And so in general rule, you don't have to identify your vehicles by law, but it's probably a good idea. And let me pause here for any questions before we get in the specific case where these things all fell apart. Let's see. Jerry's asking how much was spent on these elite teams for weeks during the holiday. It's, yeah, a lot. There's a budget question in there. John's asking whether any of this got training. We'll get to that in a second, because I don't think even the director of FPS knew what they were doing. The riot control training would have been used to refresh too. Navy veteran, yeah. There's questions on training here. I don't think they had a lot of training. This is not an operation they normally do. Customs and Border Patrol agents, ICE, U.S. Marshals, they're generally not used in crowd control. National Guard, very often used in crowd control. I mean, and not always just riots, but crowd control. Like they're managing when the food banks got overwhelmed. You send in the National Guard because they're used to dealing with crowds. They're used to dealing with large groups of people. Even if everyone's calm and peaceful, you have a Karen or a Kevin show up who's been hot and aggravated. They're going to get in your face and start shouting. You need people trained for crowd control. So National Guard typically would have more of this training, which is why they're generally the preferred, as opposed to this mismatch of federal agency. So let's talk now about a very specific incident where we can isolate this discussion. And the reason I'm picking this incident is I want to be as fair as possible to the federal officers. So what I'm actually using is there was a press conference held with the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, and the deputy director of Federal Protective Services, Chris Klein. And remember, Federal Protective Services is the agency which has deputized everyone beneath it in Portland. And so this article is fully documented in Lawfare in the bottom, but this is a situation where they were asked in a press conference about a specific question, and they offer this as their rationale. So we can use this as a breakdown of, I just went from the general, but now we're using a specific instances using the words of Homeland Security and Federal Protective Services themselves. So what happened in this press conference was Acting Secretary Chad Wolf was asked, what exactly is the standard of probable cause that you are getting when your officers seize civilians? This gets to that probable cause. It's asking, are you doing contacts, stops, or arrests? Because those probable cause levels differ and the standards are different. The acting secretary turned it over to the deputy director. And remember, this is the guy who's the deputy director of Federal Protection Services. This is the guy whose agency has been responsible for Portland. Unprovoked, that deputy director volunteered to describe the viral video of the van. This is the video everyone's seen where the van, the two federal agents come up. It's not clear who they're with. They don't say anything. They don't talk to anything. They just grab the guy and throw him in the unmarked vehicle. So he volunteered to describe that incident. So now we're talking about a very specific federal officer explaining the context of a specific incident that has been widely seen. And what he said is that federal agents had observed this man in a crowd that was in an area from which pointing a laser had occurred at a federal officer. Now, to be clear, pointing laser at federal law enforcement or any law enforcement, it's a bad idea. It's against the law. It can blind them. It can hurt them. It's not a good idea. Don't do it. But the deputy director Klein's statement wasn't that this individual had pointed the laser. He was just seen to be in an area where a laser had emerged from. The agents followed him to ask some questions, and then this is important. Klein himself confirmed that they weren't going to, they didn't think he was the person using the laser because they would have just arrested him. They thought he might know something about it. So already we've established that this person has no probable cause for having committed the crime. They may know information that the feds want to know to lead to an arrest. What Klein described is, and this isn't part of the video, so this was really interesting context, and it's interesting the rationale and justification. He says, as the federal agents and officers approach the person, they see in the distance what he described as violent demonstrators coming in their direction. So they made a decision to take the man with them. This is a very concerning development because it's basically saying that because of third-party actions, we detained the individual for their safety and our safety, as opposed to simply leaving the area and re-engaging at a later point or doing some other means. There is no constitutional justification of, I'm going to detain you because I think that that group over there is a threat. I mean, it's pretty easy to see how that could be abused in a wide variety of contexts. And so the agents wanted to get him off the street, away from the crowd. They took him to what we presume was a location that others have been taken to, where he's questioned by lawyers. You know, in the van, you see that unmarked van. And what Klein himself is saying, they took him to a place that was safe for both the officers and the individual to do the questioning. Now, this is important. If you take someone off the street, you put them in a vehicle, and you transport them to a place for questioning, that is an arrest. It doesn't matter what you call it. By constitutional precedent and law, that is an arrest. You have an effected arrest because you have taken someone, you have detained them, put them in a vehicle, transported them to a location whereupon they will be questioned. Doesn't matter if your Miranda rights or things, doesn't matter if you're released afterwards, doesn't matter if there's any documentation. You have been arrested. And you can only arrest someone off the street if you have probable cause that they committed a crime. So this is important. Klein's saying, we didn't think he committed the crime. We're pretty sure he may have had information. So we arrested him because of this third-party group we were concerned about, took him somewhere, they questioned him, and Klein says they didn't have what we needed, so they released him. So there's never been an assertion that there was a probable cause this individual committed a criminal offense. There's never been an assertion that he had the useful information. It was just that he might be. And the problem is, so first of all, this is an unconstitutional arrest in all sorts of ways, right? But the problem is, Klein went on to describe this as being misunderstood, and it wasn't a custodial arrest, which is a technical term for this arrest. He's like, oh, it wasn't a custodial, it was just an engagement. And engagement is usually referred to those contacts that when a cop comes up and says, hey, I'd like to ask you a few questions, that's an engagement. When I have detained you, put you in a van, driven you to a place, and asked you questions, that's not an engagement, that's an arrest. And you know, Klein went on to offer some things like, oh, it wasn't that bad. He wasn't tackled to the ground. He wasn't, you know, manhandled. That doesn't matter. I think it's kind of weird how distorted some of these things have gotten, where the guy says, yeah, we didn't beat him up, therefore it's not an arrest. I mean, it's like, these are heavily armed federal agents that appear out of nowhere. Of course you're going to go with them and comply, because, you know, your fears are going to get shot if you don't. So it's a little bit, I think, unreasonable to assume that people are going to just that just because you didn't tackle or punch someone, it's not an arrest. And again, these are all on the Lawfare blog. They have video to the press conference. These are using the words of the Deputy Director of the Federal Protective Services. Even they can't describe this arrest in a constitutional way. Now, this doesn't mean that all activities of unidentified vans grabbing people were unconstitutional. I don't have the background on each one. And as I said before, federal officers don't have to be identified in a van that's marked, or they don't have to be identified by, you know, name and rank. But what came out of this is a lawsuit with a judge in Oregon. There were two lawsuits. One was a cease and desist on DHS in general that got rejected for lack of standing by the state, but there was another one by press agents, and the judge in that case put a restraining order on federal agents and said, your federal agents cannot interfere, and this was journalists and the press specifically. It was a First Amendment ground interference. He said, you are prohibited from doing this kind of interference with a clearly marked press or press agent or things like that. Furthermore, the judge was about to order the use of marked vehicles and these sports jerseys to clearly identify, because he says it is such a bad idea to have unmarked federal officers engaged in this kind of law enforcement activity that DHS itself has now, just in the last 24 hours, backed away. They said they're going to use marked vehicles. They're going to switch the uniforms out, so it's you know, it's not the camo military looking. It's supposed to be a solid green with better identification. Even DHS has backed around a little bit away. So that's the situation with that one case, with that one officer. But that case, that's the viral video, does sound like a lot of the other reports. There's been another individual who came forward and described being detained in very similar circumstances. No documentation of the arrest. And when there's no documentation issued, it's very hard later to come back and prove you were detained. If you were detained, put in a vehicle, transported to a place, questioned, and released, you need to be able to prove that happened, because otherwise, how do you challenge it in court? Once that has happened, you have suffered a harm. And as a citizen, you can say, hey, that violated my Fourth Amendment rights. You didn't Mirandize me. You took me, it wasn't a lawful stop. All these things that happen when there are illegal stops. If there's no documentation, it's very hard to prove that happened. So I think we need to look at that. So I'm going to pause here and go through some questions. Jay's asking, anyone do a count of how many marked vehicles were burned early on in the protest? Because I wouldn't want to put a detainee I was responsible for on one of these days. I think that's a reasonable thing. There's a reason to use unmarked vehicles. On the other hand, I think we have to weigh that against public interest, right? The resources of the federal government and state polices versus the resources of an individual on the street, there's a huge disparity. And yes, we could say that there's a danger of putting someone in a vehicle that might be burned, but I know of no case, not just in these protests, but going back years, where someone has been in a detained vehicle and protesters have lit that vehicle on fire and caused harm to them. So I think we have to weigh, this is why states have massive amounts of budget, right? There's a disparity of the power when someone comes to you. So, and I think it's reasonable to say the vehicle can be marked, and if it's such a violent or dangerous area, maybe that's not where the arrests are being done in this kind of nature. So I would argue the edge case, but it is an edge case. I understand the valid reasons, but the video we saw was blocks away from, allegedly the things. They say they saw violent demonstrators come, but it wasn't at all clear that there was an immediate sort of crowd issue, as has been the case in some of these other areas where there's a huge crowd around them. Oh, someone came with a cure for herpes. Asmaraz, I'm if you haven't found the cure for herpes in the feed, I just hit it. So too late now. I am at the point where I am popular enough to get spammers mid-feed. So Trisha asks, has this ever been used to defend against a charge of resisting arrest? If they don't identify themselves, how could they argue that someone knew there was an arrest to resist? Actually, so in the Lawfare blog, there's 3 major Supreme Court cases I've listed. Each one of those cases is they weren't resisting arrest. So I don't know about that specific question, but they certainly were used in suits after the arrest to say this was an unconstitutional stop. And so I think you got to be very careful when you're resisting arrest, both from a legal standpoint. Resisting arrest is kind of like citizen's arrest. Technically, there's a lawful way to do it but it's a very small window with very large room for error and catastrophic consequences. A lot of people think they can do a citizen's arrest, but they're more likely to screw it up than not. Likewise, resisting arrest. There's been a few cases I know of where a person was not charged or prosecuted for harming or threatening a police officer when there was a constitutional situation that their arrest or other action was deemed somehow unlawful. But those, I can think of 3 in my head. One of them, actually very recently, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, who was in the apartment when the SWAT team came in and returned fire or opened fire. I don't know who shot first. I'm not getting into that level. But he shot at police officers, I believe, when the SWAT team raided the apartment, and was under charge for attempted murder. The prosecutor declined to press charges, saying he had a reasonable right to defend himself given the context of the situation and the police were in the wrong place. I mean, but that was a prosecutor choosing to drop it. Again, I would not advise people go out there and try and figure out the right way to resist arrest to be legal, and also the very likely consequences that even if, my dad is a lawyer, he says even if you had the right of way on a road and you get in an accident, that's great for your next of kin, right? You need to be alive to benefit from that legal, having the right of way. So it kind of applies here. I wouldn't advise people to go resisting arrest. So Trisha's asking about stop and frisk policy with the probable cause. So this is the challenge of, and I don't want to get too far into this because we're already at an hour, and I did want to get to China, but this is good. I'm enjoying this. So stop and frisk in New York City. This is actually not probable cause of the individual. The challenge with stop and frisk in a city like New York is, and I explained this further in the coastline of violence, the broken windows theory that they were basing it on says this geographic area has a high amount of crime, therefore we flood that area with police, and they simply do stops where they do the stop and frisk. Now that's a stop, because you can't just walk away from it, and it's an investigation where they're frisking. The problem is, without probable cause that individual was engaged in a crime, it's an unconstitutional stop. And stop and frisk ended up having massive problems. I think 800,000 people were arrested or detained over the lifespan, and it raises this problem of using when we get away from probable cause being, I think you specifically were involved in a criminal act and I have personal knowledge of it, to I did an analysis and people in this area are more likely to be involved in crime, or I saw you were in a crowd where a laser was pointed from, but I don't think it was you, but you may have been close to the guy. When you get away from these strict probable causes, you get into really gray areas that get very murky. And again, this creates a hardship for officers enforcing the law. I recognize that, but that's why they have resources. That's why they have tools. That's why they have training. That's why they have all of these laws that are in theory to help them, because we recognize that's difficult. So we give them lots of things and ask them to comport with the Constitution, of which limits the government overall. John Custis is asking, serious question. Undercover officers mask up for reasons, protest or not. Is there a case for law enforcement to be visible during interactions? I think there's a case for, so there's a difference between what I would call visible law enforcement and undercover operations. Undercover is surveillance, reconnaissance, things like that. There are plenty of statutory laws and case studies where undercover actions have been determined to be constitutional. Again, as I said, federal officers, there's no law where federal officers have to identify themselves. But if you're in a law enforcement, public-facing, crowd control sort of way, I say in that situation, you have to be identified, you have to be visible, you have to be somehow marked. I'm not saying, name and social security somehow marked number, but somehow you have to be recognizable as a valid form of law enforcement. How do I know that you're doing an actual job versus some guy who's got a concealed carry, or maybe not even that, claiming to be law enforcement, impersonating? I think there is a valid distinction. I don't want to get too far in it on this case because I want to get to China, but no, Tricia, you're fine. These are good conversations. This is a good conversation. I may split some of these up into segments here. So I think, John, I think there's a valid case where undercover work says, hey, obviously I can't be identified. There's a valid case to say, even when interacting with the public, with doxing and internet threats and stuff like that, you may want to limit. But if you're going to be public facing, making arrests, interacting with the public in that public way, I think there needs to be some way of identifying that person and saying it was number 7 or it was number 32 or it was ABC, but some obvious way, because that way, if an officer does abuse their power or is alleged to abuse their power, we can distinguish who that is and go back and look at the roster, who is doing it. The video shows pretty clearly. We can track back and look at that individual, and that kind of accountability may help in the long run versus, I just don't like anyone in a uniform. I mean, there's a real pushback from the DOD that these uniforms were used at all, because they're like, hey, wait a minute, people can't tell the difference between your DHS federal law officer or agent and my DOD soldier, sailor, marine, or airman, because the uniforms look the same. You got to stop that. And the Secretary of Defense really pushed back on the use of these military uniforms. And as I said, DHS has now agreed to change the uniform. So I want to pause here and get into foreign affairs, because we're at the top of the hour, but I can keep going for a little bit more. So China, moving on to China, change to China. Let's see here. I will share a screen. First things first, an overview of U.S.-China relations. The muleteers voted that the top topics they wanted to cover was Portland and the U.S.-China issue. So this is a infomullet guide. That means it's Tim's opinion, right? Of what within U.S.-China relations are legitimate national security concerns, legitimate humanitarian concerns, or nonsense. So here is a bingo board that you can say, this is what I'd like to have covered within the broad landscape of U.S.-China relations, because I've covered some of these. Like I've covered South China Sea maritime access. I've covered China buying of U.S. debt before. Kevin asked a question on that, so I covered that. I've covered some of these, but I'm happy to go over them again. So let's walk through these. Legitimate national security, the South China Sea maritime access. We've talked about that, can continue. The sphere of influence expansion to East and South Asia, that's a valid national security core. The suppression of Hong Kong, we've got national security concerns going on there that it remains as it was for economic reasons and also interactions. Cybersecurity, obviously, I don't think it surprises anyone to hear that China's been doing hacking of the federal and military, but I think it would surprise them to the extent that actors with ties to the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, have been implicated in some of these major civilian breaches. You have the Anthem and Equifax breach, 2 breaches which together I think had over 200 million personal identities compromised. Those have been tied now to Chinese state actors. And spying, national security spying is always an issue. Of course, this isn't to say like we don't have any original sin, and it's not that we're not spying on China, but I'm an American, so I'm going to be like, okay, they're spying on us. That's a legitimate national security concern. I hope we're spying on them and being effective at it and following, good tradecraft and practices. But outside of national security into humanitarian grounds, there's also some areas where there's legitimate concern on humanitarian grounds. There's the Uyghur genocide, a massive genocide. We're talking millions of people confined into what effectively are modern day concentration camps, hundreds of thousands, if not a million deaths. And this is happening in Western China. The Uyghur indigenous population, if people have heard of them at all, other than recently, they heard of there were some Uyghur terrorists that were detained with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and were in Guantanamo Bay for a while. Those are resistance fighters that have arisen from this Uyghur conflict in Western China. And there's been some terrorist acts by Uyghurs in China. But what's happened, in the last probably 5-10 years is this massive state level near genocide or actual genocide of the Uyghur population. And then obviously widespread denial of civil rights. That's always a humanitarian concern. Hong Kong suppression is a humanitarian. Social credit scoring. This is the use of vast amounts of technology and sort of China-specific internet bubbles to contain their population. And I know by doing this, to all the Chinese commentators who are going to show up on my YouTube and tell me how wrong I am and how I'm too arrogant and too American, welcome. Check out the Info Mullet, subscribe, like, follow, share. I know by putting this out there, I'm going to get a lot of hate mail from Chinese nationalists, which is fine. It goes with the territory. But the social credit scoring that China's doing, very concerning. And then we're over to the nonsense issues. And the nonsense issues are the ones that I don't think are legitimate points of concern. We got the trade deficit and the trade war. I'm going to go over that in a bit. We got China buying of U.S. debt. That's always, politicians love to beat that, but I have a clip out there on the YouTube that shows that's not really that big a deal, and it's probably being overstated. Coronavirus and COVID-19 response, that's so February. And February was like, in COVID years, February was a decade ago, right? We are so far past, the China virus and, all that stuff. It's nonsense issue. Seeds. I had no idea what was going on with the seeds. I finally caught up to it. My view, nonsense issue. It's a marketing gimmick. It's been used before. I'm not too worried about it. And then there's a general catch-all category down here, which is sort of what I call economic jingoism. Well, it's not American made, or their workers are only making $2 a day. That's often based off quasi or soft racist views of Chinese as being inferior or lesser. It doesn't really recognize the economic dynamics that have happened in the last 20 years in China. This huge explosion of the middle class in China, this huge upward swing of prosperity coming. I mean, the average wage in China now is close to the average wage in Mexico, and that's all in the last 10, 15 years. So it's a huge increase. And I think playing this, I understand why they do it for domestic reasons, but I don't want to get into that too much. So this is if you want to see one of these, put a comment in. You want to get a specific topic on them, I can cover this. And I'm going to jump into the trade deficit one specifically. So welcome everyone who's joined. If you've just joined, before I get into the trade, like, share, follow, support us on Patreon, www.patreon.com/infomullet, and let's talk about trade, because I see here John's already jumping in on trade. So there are three key errors. When we talk about the trade war, that's often about the trade deficit, and people bandy around this trade deficit without really understanding what it is. They say the trade deficit this quarter was $200 billion, or the annual trade deficit with China was $300 billion, and that's like a bad thing. So there's three errors I want to go over, which explains why this is a nonsense debate. And there's a red error that's made often by Trump and his followers. There's a blue error that's made often by Krugman and his followers. And there's a third error that never gets discussed and just drives me nuts because people miss it. But let's go through these three errors, and I think you'll see why the trade war at a big level is nonsense. I'm not saying there aren't particular issues about intellectual property, equal access of trade. Those are valid, but that's not what politicians drumbeat this trade deficit. So the red misunderstanding, trade is not a scoreboard, right? When we have a $336 billion trade deficit, which is what it was in 2017 with China, that's not like a football score, like we're behind 336 points. And I think on the red side, a lot of politicians use this as if we were champions, we'd be plus 500 trade, we'd be this. And that shows a real misunderstanding of what trade is on the macro level, but we kind of get it on the consumer level. Like, we all understand what this means. So, and I've linked an article where I describe this below when the trade armistice was signed in January. So you can find this link below on the info mullet. But let's say I walk into my favorite dining establishment of all time, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and I put $26.99 down on the table to have a bucket of hot and tasty, extra crispy, and original recipe fried chicken, right? I leave that store. My trade deficit with KFC is $26.99. They didn't give me any money. I gave them money. But what I am leaving with is a bucket of tasty chicken. A bucket of tasty chicken that I'm going to consume over the next 2 or 3 days and did not have before I put down $26.99. This is the key thing. It's not a score. It's simply an accounting of the exchange of currency, but that's only one half of what was exchanged. What was returned for that currency was a good or service we didn't have before. I walked in, I didn't have chicken. I like chicken. I like KFC chicken. I didn't have it, but I did have $26.99. I gave it to them, creating a trade deficit with KFC and left with chicken. That's all the trade deficit is on a macro level, right? What I do at a restaurant, or I go to a store and buy clothes, or Amazon or Netflix. You know, I want to watch Clone Wars on Star Wars. I don't have Clone Wars, but what I do have is a couple, virtual dollar bills burning a hole in my pocket. I give it to Netflix. I now have a trade deficit with Netflix. They aren't giving me money, but I've gotten something in return. That's what trade is. And so the trade deficit is just the accounting of the cash side of that exchange. So that's one error on the red side, where this whole premise that we need to be ahead in trade, that's one part. The second major error is the one that's led by Paul Krugman and sort of on the blue side, that the result of the trade deficit with China is because of currency manipulation. And the Krugman argument is kind of put it this way. If KFC in their dastardly ways wasn't manipulating the currency, I would have had to pay closer to $30 for that bucket of chicken. And Popeyes or Chick-fil-A or Mrs. Winners or Zaxby's or Bojangles or Church's or all these wonderful chicken places I could have gone to that maybe charged $27, $28, $29 might have gotten my money in the first place, because KFC would have been more expensive. So Krugman's argument is that because of currency manipulation, KFC's tasty chicken is artificially cheaper than those other fantastic offerings, and that puts them at a disadvantage, and it's unfairly cheap. There's 3 problems with using this as a cause for war and a trade war. First of all, Krugman never endorses a trade war to solve this. Krugman is not in favor of the trade war. I want to be very clear with that, right? He's not like, go out and do a trade war. He does recommend some policy changes for currency manipulation. But the second big thing is the consumer isn't suffering, right? I have gotten the chicken for the cheapest possible cost, and it's a fine line between government subsidies and currency manipulations and all these things, when at the end of the day, as a consumer, I got chicken for cheaper. You can parse out, and there's a lot of trade rules that parse out what's fair and unfair practices. And I think that's valid. There's a court for doing that, and there's a process by which we determine whether a practice was fair or unfair. Simply saying, well, they're manipulating the currency, that's not that process. That's not following the trade courts. The third problem gets into this third type of error. Both Krugman and Trump are relying on the deficit measure, that $336 billion of deficit. That measure is wrong. And this is the part that drives me nuts, because no one ever talks about this. But if you dig into that measure was created sometime in the 1950s, right, where trade was a lot simpler than it was now. And what it does is it takes the country of origin that's sending an export, and it says, what is the value of that good that that country exported to the country that bought it? And it simply assigns it as a trade deficit. So, it's basically saying, hey, I got the chicken from KFC. I paid $26.99. And therefore, the trade deficit with KFC is now $26.99. That works for retail. It doesn't work for world trade, and it hasn't for a long time, because there's this concept of added value that it completely mistakes. So imagine that KFC, that actual franchise store, let's say that $20 of the value of that bucket is actually the Colonel's secret recipe. I mean, it's secret for a reason. That's how good it is, right? That's got to be worth something. Let's say that's worth $20. The design of the chicken spices that makes it so tasty, that's worth $20. And that goes to the Colonel's inheritors or KFC corporate, Tricar, whatever, right? $3 of that value of chicken came from Tyson's, who is the chicken provider that provided the chickens that went into got with the secret spices on them. So $3 of the 26, that leaves $3.99, or about 11% of the actual cost of the bucket, going to that KFC franchise store I just bought it from. That is an added value approach. It totally changes. And if we were to account the bulk of the money I spent, my bulk of my trade deficit would be with the parent corporation, Tricor, I think, or Tricon, that owns Pizza Hut, KFC, Taco Bell. Most of my money would be to them. Some amount would be allocated to Tyson because they provided the chicken, and only a small amount would be to KFC. Well, this is what happens with international trade. These ratios that I used are actually not that far off from an iPhone. You take a $700 iPhone, and probably 3/4 of it comes from, the value of that $700 comes from engineering and aesthetic design done in the United States. That's where the value of it comes from. Probably another quarter, maybe, comes from component manufacturing in Germany. And the last bit, the last 11%, $700 iPhone, the last $77 comes from physical construction and configuration in China. So if we were to use a value add approach to trade deficit, we'd be actually $600 ahead. Germany would have some amount, and China would have $11. But because of the way we count trade deficit, all $700 of that iPhone, that is, I mean, it's an American-made company, Apple, all that's happening in China is final assembly. The entire $700 is allocated to China. And this really distorts the trade deficit number as we get more and more technology, more and more soft services. And the estimates I've seen when they do research on this is our trade deficit number could be off as much as 50%, right? So, and like, instead of $336 billion, we're actually only $180 billion or $150 billion trade deficit to China. So for these three reasons, I don't get overwhelmingly concerned about the trade deficit. And certainly the trade war almost never works out the way people think it does. In fact, when we started the trade war, we had $336 billion trade deficit with China. When we ended the trade war in January, we had a $353 billion trade deficit with China. We went up $25 billion because of the war. Not really a winning strategy. And we caused all this harm. When you interrupt free trade like this, supply chains, and this was all pre-pandemic. So I'm using pre-pandemic numbers because pandemic gets complicated, or really complicated. But pre-pandemic, we'd gone through these 2 years of trade war with China. We've blown apart our supply chains. If China used to get wheat from the US, maybe now they're getting it from Canadian farmer. Just because we ended the trade war doesn't mean that purchase agreement's going to shift back necessarily. And so trade wars almost never, this protectionism, tariff, trade wars, I can get into it further. But for all of these things, you know, this China-US trade deficit isn't a concern. There's a legitimate national security concerns with China. There's legitimate humanitarian concerns with China. I don't think trade is one of them. And I just wanted to go over this for an economic perspective. And so I'll see if there's questions now on China trade or questions about anything we've talked about or anything else that people are interested in. So let me go back and check the questions. If you haven't yet, like, share, follow. Subscribe to the InfoMullet on Patreon, www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. And again, our new schedule, if you're joining late, we'll have a AMA. Again, maybe a little longer, but we'll have an AMA on the first and the third Wednesday. We'll release the full episode on that first and third Friday. So the same week we do it, we'll release the full episode on YouTube. And then the segments come out on the Thursday after when it ran. That gives us a little more time. And I don't have to feel as rushed with every week I'm doing Wednesday video, Thursday segments, Friday publication again. And on those off weeks, the second and fourth week, we'll be releasing InfoMullet long form articles like we did last week. So let me see here. Questions. Rory, if we could pressure China to pay workers more than $2 a day to package and mail seeds to the U.S., then they may not have the financial resources left to buy up our debt. Yeah, and if they don't buy up our debt, then our debt gets more expensive pre-pandemic, because post-pandemic, the Fed just buys the debt. It's all an Excel sheet adjustment. You know, the pen is mightier than the sword, but Excel is mightier than both, apparently. Yeah, I get what you're saying there. Jules is asking, stop making me want fried chicken. Fried chicken is the economic proxy of choice when explaining complex economic issues in the InfoMullet. So sorry about that. By the way, it's lunch, so I may go get some fried chicken. Yeah, so the crack Kevin's brought up. I'm not worried about trade deficit, but I have worried about some of the crackpot ideas out there on nationalizing Chinese holdings of U.S. debt. That could lead to certain forms of likely proxy armed conflict. Kevin, I've talked about this before. The amount that China holds as a percent of all debt is very, very small. I think like 5%, 6%, 7%. Far more of our debt is held by U.S. pension companies and sort of financial institutions around the world as a safe harbor. And most recently, when you have quantitative easing from the Fed after the financial collapse, they're doing it again now with the pandemic. The Fed is holding increasingly more debt. Now that gets into a philosophical conundrum of who's holding our debt. The Fed, which is an independent body, is holding the U.S. government debt that authorizes the thread to exist. But that's a whole separate discussion. So I don't think there's enough Chinese held debt to, plus China needs to hold that debt because if you think about it, by buying our debt, they are able to provide savings and suppress some of the more, there's a benefit their people get. If they just stopped buying our debt, and it's a little tricky to figure out off the top of my head, they would actually be causing a harm to their own people. And that I think because of this imbalance, this deficit, this is what it was. If they weren't buying our debt to some degree, the exchange of currency flows between the two countries would cause an increase in prices for China, which would cause a decrease in sales. So there's a vested interest in China's macroeconomy to continue buying some portion of U.S. debt. I wouldn't say that we want them to buy a bunch, like 20%. Leroy Jenkins of School of Economics, chicken. Tyler, the ability to rapidly name off 10 chicken distributors is solid proof you're a fan of chicken. Thank you. That also means I've lived in Atlanta for a while. I grew up in Seattle where there is one KFC for the entire city. I don't know about now, but when I grew up, there was one. I had no natural immunity to chicken. I moved to Atlanta and there's chicken stores everywhere. It was really a eye-awakening experience, much like the Peace Corps, but with fried chicken. Questions. Optics of trade deficit are measured in manufacturing job. That's why. Yeah. So Kevin, the jobs though, Kevin brings up a good point. The optics of the trade deficit are measured in manufacturing jobs, and that's why it's a political issue. It's not the dollars directly, it's the jobs in my view. But most of the jobs that were lost are no longer in China. If you think about it, over the last 30 years, we had like cloth textiles, then fashion, then low-end design, then high-end design. These things were gradually moved. You in a free trade environment, you generally don't want to continue doing the low value activities, and you want those to reallocate to wherever there's a natural resource advantage or a natural advantage for someone to do it competitively better. The trade-off, and this is macro, is that you will be able to shift into higher value activities. The key is that transition point. When someone loses their job, how do you support them during that transition? And I think when we saw, the textile jobs moved to China decades ago, those jobs are no longer in China because those jobs went to Vietnam. So China could say, hey, we've lost our manufacturing jobs to Vietnam, but they've moved up the scale. And this is how free economies work, is there's always this trade and interchange, and the effort to design, like to pick a part of the economy and say, I'm going to save this manufacturing job, or I'm going to save this service job, or I'm going to diminish this manufacturing. The intervention itself, because it's so complicated and so fluid and dynamic, the effort to intervene politically often creates more harm than it does good. And we can give an example. During the trade war, we increase a barrier on steel imports, for example. That helps steel jobs and people who rely on steel jobs in the US. This has been, like Bush did a steel tariff. The problem is anyone who uses steel now has to pay more. So car manufacturers had to pay more for the steel, which increases the car consumers. So even within a domestic economy, anytime you have these trade interventions, you're really not just saying domestic workers versus foreign workers, you're favoring certain kinds of domestic workers over other kinds of domestic workers. And it's really tricky to parse out that balancing act. And you can do subsidies and pluses and minuses, but it gets to the point where you're just doing so much complexity. I think the better approach is to have a freer market and then supplement transition assistance for people who are harmed, because there's going to be winners and losers. You help the people who are on the downside of that exchange, retraining, support, getting into new industries. You don't just abandon them. I think that's probably the simpler approach. Yeah, and Abigail's talking about this. Great example, Abigail. Farmers here in Georgia are still suffering. There's farmers in Georgia send a lot of produce or food food products and maybe even chicken over to China. For the manufacturing jobs we may or may not have saved, Kevin, we also harmed the farmers who still haven't had those contracts come back. And that's the hard part of managing those trade-offs. I think it's really, really complex, and why generally there are more. Now, free trade agreements are probably a more sophisticated way of balancing those concerns, because in a free trade agreement like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you have the ability to very finely tune things, and it's often why they take years and years to put together. Taking a meat cleaver to them and doing something like a trade war, probably not going to be that effective. So good comments, good discussion. We're 30 minutes after the top of the hour. That's all I had to cover for today. Hope you like the new format where there's a mix of domestic and foreign. It's okay if we go a little bit long because I don't have to do this every week. Saves me a lot of stress levels too. Any final questions before we go? While I'll pitch. We're now doing a lot of content on Twitter. It's recycled older posts. So if you want to see our archive of posts that go back years, subscribe to us at Twitter. We'll do YouTube segments, content. I'm not doing as much chatting there yet just because I'm getting things ramped up. We have a YouTube channel now, which is youtube.com/c/theinfomullet. We've got probably 100 pieces of content on there. We have the blog, infomullet.com. That's got another 300 pieces of content. That actually has close to 1,500 articles going back to 2001, a continuous archive and commentary, but it's going to take a while to unearth those, edit those, and get them posted. And of course, we have the Facebook here where you are, facebook.com/infomullet. So there's a lot of ways to engage. If you haven't yet, become a subscriber. Check us out, www.patreon.com/infomullet. Appreciate all the muleteers, senior muleteers, and Medici muleteer subscribers out there. Benefits of, you get access to the ability to help influence what we're going to cover. The topics today, Portland and China, were in some part decided by muleteers and senior muleteers who got to vote and prioritize. I want to be transparent. I never relinquish editorial control. I don't want to relinquish integrity. I will say, here's the topics I'm willing to cover. You help me prioritize them, or here's some choices. Which do you want more emphasis on? But I'm never going to sacrifice. It's more important to be accurate than right. So if no one else has any questions, I haven't seen any. Everyone take care of yourself. Please stay inside if you can. Stay safe if you can't. And have yourself a good day. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a muleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.